The bustling Atlanta International Airport was at its peak on a warm Tuesday afternoon. Through the sea of rushing travelers, a well-dressed black man in his early 40s made his way across the polished floor. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the tiles as he walked, one hand gripping an expensive briefcase while the other held his phone to his ear. As the CEO of one of America's fastest-growing tech companies, he lived life in the fast lane. His schedule was always packed with meetings, presentations, and flights from one city to another. Today was no different. He was heading to Silicon Valley for a crucial meeting with potential investors. The stakes were high, and he couldn't afford any delays. "Yes, I'm almost at the gate," he spoke into his phone, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone used to being in charge. "Tell the board I'll have the presentations ready before." His voice trailed off as something caught his eye. Among the rush of people, an elderly white woman stood near a flight information board. She was probably in her late 70s, wearing a simple floral dress and a beige cardigan that seemed a size too big for her thin frame. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, but her hands trembled as she squinted at the bright screen above. Next to her sat two bags, one old-fashioned suitcase with worn wheels and a smaller carry-on that had seen better days. What struck him most wasn't just her obvious confusion, but how invisible she seemed to everyone else. Business people rushed past with their eyes glued to phones. Flight attendants rolled their luggage by without a glance. Young travelers with headphones bobbed their heads to music, lost in their own worlds. In the middle of this human hurricane, she stood like a forgotten lighthouse, growing more distressed by the minute. He watched as she approached a young couple for help, only to have them hurry past with quick "sorry, we're late" mumbled under their breaths. She turned to her airport staff member, but he was busy directing a large family with crying children. Her shoulders slumped a little more with each rejection, and her hands clutched her boarding pass tighter. Something about her reminded him of his own grandmother, who had passed away 5 years ago. He remembered how she used to say that you could judge a society by how it treated its elderly. Right now, society wasn't scoring very high points. "I'll call you back," he said into his phone, ending the call mid-sentence. He checked his watch. His flight was boarding in 20 minutes, and his gate was on the other side of the terminal. Every business instinct told him to keep walking. The meeting in Silicon Valley could shape his company's future. He had shareholders to think about, employees counting on him. But his grandmother's voice echoed in his head. "Money can buy a lot of things, baby, but it can't buy back a moment when you could have helped someone and chose not to." He slipped his phone into his pocket and adjusted his course. As he got closer, he could see tears forming in the woman's eyes as she looked back and forth between her boarding pass and the screen above. Her hands were shaking so badly now that she dropped her passport, and when she tried to bend down to pick it up, she almost lost her balance. Without thinking, he quickened his pace, reaching the passport just as she steadied herself against her suitcase. "Ma'am," he said gently, holding out her passport, "let me help you with that." She looked up at him, and for a moment he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, uncertainty, maybe even a touch of fear. It was a look he had seen before, being a black man in America. But then her face softened into a grateful smile that reached all the way to her tired eyes. "Oh, thank you, young man," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "I'm afraid these old eyes aren't what they used to be, and they've changed my gate number. I've been standing here for almost an hour trying to figure out where I'm supposed to go." He smiled warmly, remembering how his grandmother used to call everyone young, even when they were pushing 50. "Where are you heading to?" he asked, gesturing at her boarding pass. "Seattle," she replied, carefully handing him the crumpled paper. "My grandson is getting married tomorrow, and I can't miss it. He's the only family I have left." As he looked at her boarding pass, he realized her situation was worse than he'd thought. Her flight had been rescheduled due to weather delays, and her new gate was in an entirely different terminal. Getting there would require taking the airport train, something that would be challenging for her to manage alone with her luggage. He glanced at his watch again. His own flight would start boarding any minute now. Then he looked at the elderly woman's hopeful face, and suddenly, his decision didn't feel like a decision at all. Some things were more important than business meetings, even billion-dollar ones. "Tell you what," he said, reaching for her suitcase handle, "why don't you let me help you get to your gate? We can take our time, and I'll make sure you get there safely." The elderly woman's eyes widened at his offer, a mix of relief and hesitation crossing her face. "Oh, but I couldn't possibly. You must have your own flight to catch. Everyone's so busy these days, and I don't want to be a bother." He smiled, already pulling her worn suitcase alongside his briefcase. "It's no bother at all. My grandmother would never forgive me if I left someone's grandmother stranded in an airport." His words seemed to break through her last bit of resistance, and her shoulders relaxed visibly. As they started walking toward the airport train, she told him about her grandson's wedding. Her voice grew stronger with each step, as if the simple act of having someone listen was giving her renewed energy. "He's marrying such a sweet girl," she said, her eyes twinkling. "They met while volunteering at a homeless shelter. Can you believe that? In this day and age, when everyone meets through those phone apps, my grandson found love while serving soup to the less fortunate." The tech CEO couldn't help but chuckle at her subtle dig at modern dating apps, considering his company had just launched a new social media platform last month. But there was wisdom in her words that no algorithm could match. They reached the escalator leading down to the train platform, and he noticed how she hesitated before stepping on. Without making a fuss, he positioned himself one step below her, his broad shoulders creating a protective barrier. It was a small gesture, but she grabbed the handrail with more confidence. "You remind me of one of my former students," she said suddenly, studying his face. "I taught high school for over 40 years, you know. Inner-city Detroit, during times when things weren't easy for anyone, especially," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "especially when people looked different from each other." He helped her off the escalator, genuinely intrigued. "Detroit? That's where I grew up. Which school did you teach at?" Before she could answer, the airport train arrived with a whoosh of air that ruffled her cardigan. He guided her inside, finding a seat for her while securing their luggage. The train wasn't crowded, but a young man absorbed in his phone occupied the priority seating. Without saying a word, the CEO cleared his throat and gave him a meaningful look. The young man glanced up, flushed red, and quickly offered his seat to the elderly woman. As the train moved between terminals, she continued her story. "I taught at Washington High School from 1965 to 1992. Those were challenging years, but also the most rewarding of my life. I had students from all walks of life, all colors, all backgrounds. Some of them had never had a white teacher before, and I had never taught in a predominantly black school. We learned from each other every single day." His heart skipped a beat. Washington High School, that's where his mother had studied. The same mother who had pushed him to pursue his dreams in technology, who had worked 3 jobs to put him through college, who had always talked about a special teacher who changed her life. The elderly woman reached into her large handbag, pulling out an old leather wallet. "I still carry this with me everywhere I go," she said, carefully removing a folded photograph. "My class of 1968. Some of these students went on to become doctors, lawyers, teachers. One young lady became an engineer when hardly any women, let alone black women, were in that field." His hands trembled slightly as he took the photograph. The colors had faded to sepia tones, but the faces were clear, young, hopeful, standing on the steps of Washington High School. And there, in the front row, wearing a modest dress and the brightest smile, was his mother. The train announcement interrupted the moment, now arriving at Terminal B. He carefully handed back the photograph, his mind racing. Should he tell her? Would she even believe him? As they exited the train, she stumbled slightly on the gap between the train and the platform. He caught her elbow, steadying her, and in that moment made his decision. Some coincidences were too meaningful to ignore. They walked through Terminal B in comfortable silence, both lost in their thoughts. He pushed their luggage, watching her from the corner of his eye. This woman, who had helped shape his mother's future, who had believed in her students during one of America's most turbulent times, was now struggling to read gate numbers in an airport. Life had a strange way of coming full circle. They passed a coffee shop, and the aroma of fresh coffee filled the air. "Would you like to sit down for a moment?" he asked, noticing her slightly labored breathing. "We have time before your flight, and I'd love to hear more about your teaching days." She agreed with a grateful nod, and as they settled into a quiet corner table, he realized his own flight had probably already started boarding. Somehow, it didn't seem important anymore. His assistant could rebook him on a later flight, and the investors would wait. Right now, he was exactly where he needed to be. As the barista brought their drinks, a chamomile tea for her and a black coffee for him, he gathered his courage. Sometimes the biggest moments in life came disguised as small decisions, like helping a stranger in an airport. He took a deep breath and said, "Ma'am, I don't believe in coincidences. And I think there's something you should know about one of your students from 1968. The elderly woman wrapped her thin fingers around her teacup, steam rising in gentle swirls between them. Her eyes, bright with curiosity, met his across the small airport cafe table. "About one of my students?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. He pulled out his phone, fingers moving quickly across the screen until he found what he was looking for, a photo from his mother's 70th birthday celebration last month. In it, his mother wore a bright yellow dress, her silver hair styled elegantly, her smile just as radiant as it had been in that old high school photo. "Do you recognize her?" he asked softly, turning the phone toward the elderly teacher. The woman's hand trembled as she reached for her reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. She put them on carefully, squinting at the screen. For a moment, there was silence. Then her free hand flew to her mouth, and tears welled up in her eyes. Oh my goodness," she whispered, looking back and forth between the photo and his face. That's little Rhodes from my advanced chemistry class. But she's my mother," he finished gently, watching as understanding dawned in her eyes. The elderly woman set down her teacup with shaking hands, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Your mother? You're Rose's son. The little boy she used to talk about." Her voice cracked with emotion. "She was one of my brightest students, so determined, so brilliant. She wanted to be an engineer when everyone told her it wasn't possible. She did become an engineer," he said proudly, his own eyes growing misty. "She was one of the first black women to graduate from MIT's engineering program. And it was because of you, Mrs." He paused, realizing he still didn't know her name. "Mrs. Anderson," she supplied, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue from her purse. "But your mother always called me Miss Betty." "Miss Betty," he repeated, the name stirring distant memories. "Mom used to talk about you all the time when I was growing up. She told me how you stayed after school to help her prepare for college entrance exams, how you wrote her letter of recommendation for MIT, how you stood up for her when other teachers said she was reaching too high." Mrs. Anderson shook her head, more tears falling. "I only opened the door. Rose walked through it all on her own. She was exceptional, so many of my students were. They just needed someone to believe in them." She reached across the table and grasped his hand. "Look at you now. A successful businessman helping a stranger in an airport. She must be so proud." He squeezed her hand gently. "She is, but she'd be even prouder to know I'm helping you. You know, she still has the book you gave her, Women in Science. She kept it all these years, read it to me when I was little." Mrs. Anderson's eyes lit up with recognition. "I gave that book to all my female students who showed interest in science. Back then, there weren't many books showing women, especially women of color, in scientific fields. I wanted them to see what was possible." A passing flight announcement echoed through the terminal, but neither of them paid it any attention. They were lost in a moment where past and present had collided in the most beautiful way. "Your mother," Mrs. Anderson continued, her voice growing stronger with memories she used to tutor other students during lunch breaks. "Did she ever tell you that? She'd help them with math and chemistry. Some days, she'd skip eating just to help others understand a difficult concept. I used to bring her extra sandwiches because I knew she wasn't eating." He shook his head, a lump forming in his throat. His mother had never mentioned that part. It explained so much about her, why she always packed extra food for his school lunches just in case someone else needs it, why she'd spent every weekend of his childhood tutoring neighborhood kids for free. "Would you?" He hesitated, then pulled out his phone again. "Would you like to talk to her? She'd love to hear your voice." Mrs. Anderson's eyes widened. "Oh, but it's so early in Detroit. I couldn't possibly." "Mom's still an early riser," he smiled, already dialing. Some habits from those dawn study sessions never changed. As the phone rang, Mrs. Anderson smoothed her cardigan and wiped her eyes again, as if preparing to meet a class of students. He put the phone on speaker, and after 2 rings, his mother's warm voice filled their corner of the airport cafe. "Baby, aren't you supposed to be on a flight to Silicon Valley? His mother answered, concern in her voice. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you'll never believe who I'm sitting with right now. I'm at Atlanta Airport and I met someone very special from Washington High School, 1968. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then softly, hopefully, from Washington High, 1968, Mrs. Anderson leaned toward the phone, her voice wavering but clear. "Hello, Rose. This is Miss Betty. I just saw a picture of you in that beautiful yellow dress, and you're still smiling just as bright as you did in chemistry class." The gasp on the other end of the line was followed by a sob. Miss Betty Anderson. Oh my God, oh my God." His mother's voice broke with emotion. You changed my life. You made me believe I could be anything." And there, in a quiet corner of the world's busiest airport, 3 lives connected across decades of history, proving that some teachers never stop teaching, some lessons never stop mattering, and some circles were meant to be completed in the most unexpected ways. The conversation flowed like a river breaking through a dam, years of unspoken gratitude and memories rushing forth. Around them, the airport bustled with its usual chaos, but in their quiet corner, time seemed to stand still. His mother's voice through the phone speaker was filled with emotion as she recalled moments from her past. "Miss Betty, do you remember that day when the lab equipment broke during our chemistry experiment?" His mother asked, laughing through her tears. "You drove to 3 different schools to borrow what we needed because you didn't want us to miss out on learning." Mrs. Anderson chuckled, wiping her eyes with a fresh tissue. "Oh my, I'd forgotten about that. And do you remember how you figured out a way to make the experiment work with even less equipment than we had? That's when I knew you were going to be an extraordinary engineer." As they talked, he noticed Mrs. Anderson's hands had stopped shaking. She sat straighter in her chair, her voice stronger, as if the years had fallen away, and she was back in her classroom, surrounded by the students she loved. His mother's voice, too, had taken on the eager tone of a young student excited to share her achievements with a beloved teacher. "Miss Betty," his mother said softly, "I need to tell you something. Every time I walked into a boardroom full of men who didn't think I belonged there, I heard your voice in my head saying, 'Stand tall, speak clear, and show them what you know.' When I doubted myself during those late nights studying at MIT, I'd read the letter of recommendation you wrote for me. I kept it all these years." The elderly teacher pressed her hand to her heart. "Oh, Rose, I just wanted all my students to have a fair chance. Back then, the world wasn't very fair, was it? But you took every opportunity and ran with it." He watched as his mother and her former teacher bridged decades of separation, filling in the gaps of their lives. He learned how his mother wasn't the only student Mrs. Anderson had helped. There were dozens of others, kids from poor families, immigrant children struggling with English, students facing discrimination, and she had fought for each one of them. "My son," his mother said proudly, "the one sitting with you now, he's the CEO of his own technology company. He employs over 300 people, and do you know what makes me proudest? He made sure his company has one of the best diversity and education programs in the industry. He provides scholarships for underprivileged students, just like someone once did for me." Mrs. Anderson turned to him, her eyes shining. "Is this true?" He nodded, somewhat embarrassed by his mother's praise. "Mom taught me that success means nothing if you don't lift others up along the way. That's something she learned from you, Miss Betty." A flight announcement echoed through the terminal. Final boarding call for Flight 238 to Seattle. Mrs. Anderson started, suddenly remembering her grandson's wedding. "Oh dear, that's my flight." "Mom, we've got to go," he said quickly. "Mrs. Anderson needs to catch her plane." "Wait," his mother called through the phone. "Miss Betty, which hotel are you staying at in Seattle? I'm going to book a flight right now. I need to hug you in person." As he helped Mrs. Anderson gather her belongings, she gave his mother the hotel details with a trembling voice. "Rose, you don't have to." "Try and stop me," his mother laughed. "I've waited 55 years to thank you properly. Besides, I need to meet your grandson and tell him what an extraordinary grandmother he has." They hurried through the terminal, him carrying both bags while keeping a supportive hand near Mrs. Anderson's elbow. Other travelers turned to look at them, the tall, well-dressed black man in his expensive suit helping an elderly white woman who couldn't stop smiling through her tears. Some smiled, perhaps sensing they were witnessing something special. At the gate, The flight attendant was about to close the door but paused when she saw them approaching. He quickly explained the situation, and his business class status didn't hurt in convincing her to wait a few more moments. Before Mrs. Anderson boarded, she turned to him and opened her arms. He stepped into her embrace, and she hugged him tightly, like a proud teacher seeing her legacy living on through generations. "You tell your company's board members I said to reschedule that meeting," she said firmly, straightening his tie with teacher-like authority. "Some things are more important than business deals." He grinned. "Yes, ma'am." As she walked down the jet bridge, she turned back one last time. "Your mother was right. You're just like her. Standing tall, speaking clear, and showing the world what you know. But more importantly," her voice softened, "showing them what's in your heart." The gate agent closed the door, and he stood at the window, watching as the plane slowly backed away from the gate. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "I got a flight to Seattle in 3 hours. Sending you the details. We're having dinner with Miss Betty tonight. No excuses." He smiled, already planning to book his own flight to Seattle. Some meetings were too important to miss, and this one had been 55 years in the making. 5 hours later, the Seattle sky welcomed 3 souls brought together by fate. The tech CEO had managed to book a flight that landed just 30 minutes after his mother's. They met at the airport, sharing a tearful embrace before heading straight to Mrs. Anderson's hotel near the wedding venue. The hotel lobby was elegant but welcoming, with warm lighting that cast a gentle glow over the reunion about to unfold. His mother smoothed her travel clothes nervously, looking like a schoolgirl about to give a presentation. 55 years melted away as the elevator doors opened and Mrs. Anderson stepped out. For a moment, both women just stared at each other. Then his mother broke into a run, something he'd never seen her do before, and threw her arms around her former teacher. They held each other tight, both crying and laughing at the same time, while other hotel guests smiled at the touching scene. "Let me look at you properly," Mrs. Anderson said, holding his mother at arm's length. "Still got that spark in your eyes, just like in chemistry class." She turned to him. "You know, your mother once set up an extra experiment after school just to prove a theory she had. Stayed until the janitor kicked us out." His mother laughed through her tears. "You never told me I was wrong, even when my first 3 attempts failed. You just said, 'What did we learn from this?' and helped me try again." They made their way to the hotel's restaurant, where Mrs. Anderson's grandson had reserved a private dining area for them. The young man had been overjoyed to learn about the unexpected reunion and insisted on arranging everything. As they settled into their seats, stories began flowing as freely as the wine. "Do you still have that old microscope?" his mother asked. "The one you bought with your own money because the school wouldn't fund new equipment." Mrs. Anderson's eyes lit up. "I donated it to the school when I retired. But here's something you didn't know. That microscope, it wasn't just my money. Other teachers pitched in when they heard what I was trying to do. The music teacher, the gym coach, even the cafeteria lady gave what she could. That's what community really means." The CEO listened fascinated as the 2 women pieced together a history he'd only heard fragments of before. His mother spoke about the challenges she'd faced as the only black woman in her engineering classes, how she'd draw strength from remembering Mrs. Anderson's words. "They're not smarter than you, they just had a head start, so run faster." Mrs. Anderson shared stories about other students she'd kept track of over the years. A boy who became a pediatrician and opened a clinic in their old neighborhood. A girl who went on to become a state judge. Another who returned to Washington High School as a teacher, carrying on the tradition of lifting others up. "But there's something I never told any of you," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice growing serious. "That year, 1968, the school board tried to fire me. They said I was causing disruption by encouraging African American students to apply to prestigious universities. Some parents complained that I was giving their children unrealistic expectations." His mother gasped, "We never knew." The elderly teacher smiled. "You weren't supposed to know. Your education was what mattered, not the politics behind it. But here's the beautiful part. The local community rallied around me. Parents from all backgrounds came to school board meetings to support me. They understood that education should have no barriers." The CEO reached for his mother's hand under the table, feeling her trembling. All these years, and there were still layers to uncover, still debts of gratitude to be paid. "Miss Betty," he said, using the name that felt most natural now, "I've been thinking. My company has a foundation that supports educational initiatives. We'd like to create a scholarship program in your name, the Betty Anderson Excellence in Education Fund. It would help students who show promise in science and technology, especially those facing the kind of barriers my mother once faced." Mrs. Anderson's hand flew to her heart. "Oh, my dear boy." "That's not all," he continued. "We want to renovate the science labs at Washington High School. New equipment, modern technology, everything today's students need to succeed. And we'd like you to be part of the planning committee to make sure we honor the spirit of what you built there." His mother squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Anderson sat in stunned silence, her eyes moving between mother and son. "You see," he explained gently, "what you did wasn't just about teaching chemistry or writing college recommendations. You showed people how to believe in themselves, and more importantly, how to believe in others. That's a legacy worth preserving." Before Mrs. Anderson could respond, her grandson appeared at the restaurant entrance, handsome in his wedding rehearsal outfit. He rushed over to their table, hugging his grandmother before turning to her unexpected guests with a warm smile. "I had to come see this for myself," he said, pulling up a chair. "Grandma's been telling me stories about her teaching days my whole life. Now I finally get to meet some of the people from those stories." As the young man joined their table, the past, present, and future seemed to merge into one beautiful moment. Here was Mrs. Anderson's grandson, about to start his own family, sitting with living proof of how one person's dedication to teaching could echo through generations. Mrs. Anderson reached for her purse and pulled out that treasured old photo from 1968. She placed it in the center of the table, and they all leaned in to look at those young faces full of hope and determination. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "at the wedding, I'm going to tell everyone this story. Because love isn't just about romance, it's about what happens when we open our hearts to others, when we believe in people's potential, when we fight for their dreams as if they were our own." The CEO looked around the table, at his mother, who had broken barriers and inspired him to dream big, at Mrs. Anderson, who had changed countless lives with her courage and compassion, at the grandson, who was carrying forward a legacy of love and service to others. Sometimes the greatest chapters of our lives begin with a simple choice to help a stranger. In this case, that choice had brought them full circle, proving that kindness has a way of multiplying, of rippling out across decades and generations, creating waves of change that none of us can fully measure. The next morning dawned bright and clear in Seattle, perfect weather for a wedding. The CEO adjusted his tie in his hotel room mirror, thinking about how differently this day might have turned out if he hadn't stopped to help an elderly woman at the airport. His mother knocked on his door, already dressed in a beautiful deep purple dress she'd somehow managed to find at the hotel's boutique. "Ready?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I can't believe we're about to attend Miss Betty's grandson's wedding. Life has such wonderful surprises." They arrived at the garden venue early, helping Mrs. Anderson with some last-minute preparations. The elderly teacher had insisted they'd be treated as family, not guests. She moved with renewed energy, the years seeming to fall away, as she directed flower arrangements and supervised seating charts with the same attention to detail she once gave to chemistry experiments. "You know," she confided to them as they arranged place cards, "I wasn't sure about having a big wedding for my grandson. At my age, sometimes you feel like you're just taking up space in other people's happy moments. But now," she smiled, looking around at the bustling preparations, "now I understand why God kept me around long enough for this day." His mother squeezed Mrs. Anderson's hand. "You were meant to be here, meant to see your legacy bloom in ways you never expected." As other guests began arriving, word spread quickly about the remarkable story behind the unexpected additions to the wedding party. People gathered in small groups, whispering and pointing discreetly at the successful black CEO and his mother, amazed by the tale of their connection to the grandmother of the groom. The wedding planner approached them nervously. "Mrs. Anderson, the bride heard your story, and, well, she's asking if you would mind sharing it during the reception. She says it's exactly the kind of love story they want to celebrate today." Mrs. Anderson looked surprised, then touched. "But it's their special day." Actually, the bride herself appeared, beautiful in her white dress, her eyes shining with tears. "It would mean the world to us. Your grandson told me all your teaching stories when we were dating. He said you taught him that love means believing in people even when they don't believe in themselves. That's exactly why I fell in love with him." The ceremony itself was beautiful, but the real magic happened during the reception. After the traditional speeches, Mrs. Anderson stood up, her hands steady as she held the microphone. The room fell silent as she began to speak. 55 years ago, she said, her voice clear and strong, "I was a young teacher in Detroit, trying to make a difference in a world that didn't always want to change. Yesterday, in an airport hundreds of miles away, that difference found its way back to me." She told their story, not just the airport encounter, but the whole journey, the struggles of teaching in the 1960s, the fights for equal education, the students who dared to dream bigger than society allowed. As she spoke, people began wiping away tears. The photographer captured candid shots of guests holding hands across tables, of couples leaning into each other, of young people looking inspired. And now, Mrs. Anderson continued, gesturing to the CEO and his mother, "These beautiful souls are here today, proving that love doesn't just move forward in time, it reaches backward too, healing old wounds, closing circles we didn't even know were open." The bride and groom held each other, crying openly. The CEO noticed several older guests nodding in recognition. They were teachers too, he later learned, colleagues of Mrs. Anderson who had fought the same battles. When Mrs. Anderson finished speaking, the entire room rose in a standing ovation. The bandleader, moved by the moment, began playing "What a Wonderful World" as Mrs. Anderson made her way back to their table. Later, during the dancing, young people kept approaching their table, asking questions about the old days, about teaching, about making a difference. A young girl, barely teenage, stood shyly before Mrs. Anderson. "My mom's a teacher," she said quietly. "Sometimes she comes home crying because it's so hard. Can I take a picture with you? I want to show her that what she's doing matters, that it lasts." The CEO watched as Mrs. Anderson posed with the girl, then gathered her close and whispered something in her ear. The girl's face lit up, and she rushed off to share whatever wisdom she'd received with her parents. "What did you tell her?" he asked curiously. Mrs. Anderson smiled. "I told her what I tell all young people, that love is the best kind of teacher, and teaching is the best kind of love." As the evening wore on, the CEO noticed something remarkable. The usual wedding divisions, family on one side, friends on another, old and young separated by invisible barriers, had dissolved. People moved between tables freely, sharing stories, exchanging contact information, making plans to stay in touch. His mother sat with a group of young teachers, sharing her experiences and offering encouragement. The bride's college-age sister was deep in conversation with Mrs. Anderson about her dreams of becoming a special education teacher. Even the wedding photographers had put down their cameras at times, drawn into the atmosphere of connection and possibility. "Look what you started," he told Mrs. Anderson as they watched the celebrations. "All because you chose to believe in a young girl in Detroit half a century ago." She patted his hand. "No, my dear. All because you chose to help an old woman in an airport yesterday. We never know which moment will be the one that changes everything. We just have to be brave enough to live them all with love." As the Seattle sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the wedding garden, the CEO looked around at this unlikely gathering. A testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't just about romance. They're about the courage to care, the choice to help, and the endless ripples that one act of kindness can create across time. 1 month after the wedding, the hallways of Washington High School buzzed with excitement. Students pressed their faces against classroom windows, trying to catch a glimpse of the gathering in the schoolyard. Television crews set up their equipment, while photographers adjusted their cameras. The whole community had turned out for what the local paper called a dream coming full circle. The CEO stood at a podium, his mother and Mrs. Anderson seated proudly behind him. Before them stretched rows of students, teachers, and community members, all gathered for the groundbreaking ceremony of the new science building and the announcement of the Betty Anderson Excellence in Education Fund. "When I was a boy," he began, his voice carrying across the schoolyard, "my mother used to tell me stories about a special teacher who changed her life. I used to think it was just a nice story. Then, a month ago, I missed a flight because I stopped to help an elderly woman in an airport." He paused, smiling at the ripple of laughter from the crowd. "That delay turned out to be the best business decision I've ever made." In the front row, several of Mrs. Anderson's former students from different years sat together, some having traveled from across the country for this event. They weren't just successful professionals now, they were living proof that one person's belief in you could change everything. "Today," the CEO continued, "we're not just breaking ground on a new building. We're continuing a legacy. The Betty Anderson Science Center will be more than just state-of-the-art labs and modern equipment. It will be a place where every student who walks through these doors knows that someone believes in them." Mrs. Anderson, despite protests that she didn't need to, rose to address the crowd. Her voice might have grown softer with age, but her words carried the same strength they had back in 1968. "When I look at these faces," she said, gesturing to the students, "I see the same light I saw in my students 55 years ago. The world has changed since then, but dreams haven't. They still need someone to believe in them, to nurture them, to fight for them." She turned to the current teachers in the audience. "Your job isn't easy. Some days, you'll wonder if you're making a difference at all. But let me tell you something. 30 years from now, one of your students might stop to help someone in an airport, and a whole new chapter of this story will begin." The crowd erupted in applause as Mrs. Anderson hugged each of her former students present. The current principal of Washington High School stepped forward with a surprise announcement. The school board had unanimously voted to rename the school's annual Teaching Excellence Award the Betty Anderson Champion of Dreams Award. But the real magic happened after the ceremony, when students and teachers gathered in small groups around Mrs. Anderson and her former students. Young people listened wide-eyed as these successful professionals shared their stories of struggle and triumph. A shy girl in the back raised her hand. "Ma'am," she asked Mrs. Anderson, "how did you know which students to believe in?" The elderly teacher's eyes twinkled. My dear, that's the easiest question I've ever been asked. I believed in all of them. Every single one. Because that's what teachers do. We see the potential in every child, even when they can't see it themselves." The CEO's mother stepped forward, adding, "And sometimes, that belief is all it takes to change a life. I know it changed mine." As the crowd began to disperse, a local reporter asked the CEO about the surprising cost of the new Science Center and Scholarship Fund, nearly $50 million. "Isn't that a lot to invest based on a chance encounter in an airport?" He smiled, watching Mrs. Anderson surrounded by eager students and teachers. "The most valuable investments aren't always about money. They're about people, about believing in something bigger than yourself. Besides," he added, "I'd say the return on investment started the moment I stopped to help her read that airport screen." Later that evening, at a small dinner celebration, Mrs. Anderson handed each of her former students present a small package. Inside each one was a copy of that treasured class photo from 1968, professionally restored and framed. "I kept these all these years," she said softly, "because I knew each of you would do something amazing with your lives. But I never imagined you'd come back here to help a new generation do the same." The CEO looked around the table at these accomplished individuals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers, all brought together by one woman's dedication to education. His mother reached for Mrs. Anderson's hand. "You know what amazes me," his mother said. "All those years ago, when people said we couldn't succeed, you never fought them with anger. You fought them with love, with belief, with dedication. You taught us to do the same." Mrs. Anderson smiled, tears in her eyes. "And look what that love has created. Look at all of you, still helping others, still believing in dreams. That's the real miracle, not just that you succeeded, but that you're making sure others can succeed too." As the evening wound down, the CEO's phone buzzed with news that the story had gone viral. #AirportAngle and #BelievingDreams were trending nationwide. Messages poured in from teachers and students across the country, sharing their own stories of educators who changed their lives. "Well," Mrs. Anderson chuckled, reading some of the messages, "it seems we've started something." "No," the CEO corrected gently, "you started something 55 years ago. We're just helping it grow." And there, in that moment, surrounded by the fruits of a lifetime of believing in others, they all understood a profound truth. Sometimes the greatest journeys don't take us to new places, but bring us full circle back to where love and belief first changed everything.